Hello there. So I'd like to make this video about what I believe to be the tactics used by cultural Marxists on the left, and that includes any form of queer theory, critical race theory, gender theory, radical feminism, particularly of the third wave variety. All of the things that came out of the Frankfurt School, the primarily Jewish socialists who escaped Germany after corrupting the economy and then came to America with refugee status and began the 100-year process of corrupting the American society, which is now coming to a head in things like the Evergreen riots, which I've made a video on, and the riots that are happening every day at colleges where these blue-haired lesbians and black feminists and all these people are attempting to gain verbal power and gain power by being raging cunts, and are using force and intimidation and silencing tactics and all this. It is a feminine archetype gone insane that needs to be effectively removed from the political conversation unless we want them to further cause chaos. So, a lot of people have a false idea about what these constructs are. The Black Lives Matter, the what's it called? And not in terms of like saying that Black Lives Matter. I'm talking about the movement. The radical feminism, the Occupy Wall Street type people, the people who made Chaz. All of these people are effectively, whether consciously or unconsciously, possessed by a certain type of ideology. And the ideology is neo-Marxist, it's Hegelian, it's utopian, and it's postmodern. And what this means effectively is that there's a couple tenets of this. One, they are using the idea of a utopian vision to fuel a potential revolution. That's the utopianism and the Marxism. They, instead of traditional Marxism, where traditional Marxism uses economic inequality as justification for a proletariat uprising, they are using racial and other minority status as a justification for utopian revolution or liberation. And that's not really the most important part of this, though. The most important part is their view on speech, their view on argumentative tactics. Because when we debate people politically, when we attempt to have a rational discussion, we're assuming certain things. We're assuming that the other person is not going to contradict themselves on purpose. We're assuming that the other person believes in things like logical coherence. We're assuming that the other person has the same definition of sense-making as we do. And so there are basically these fundamental rules that go all the way back to ancient Greece. Basically, logical fallacies are the breaking of these rules. They're breaking of the necessary underlying mathematical structure of our arguments that allows us, as people who are inheritors of a very deep social tradition, political tradition, to actually discuss things. There was a famous entomologist, I forget his name. He said that even if ants could speak, humans and ants would have nothing to talk about because the ants' world is very different than our world. And there's a deep message there, which is that if people share different assumptions than you, core fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to communicate with them. We can only communicate with people to the degree that they share our initial axioms. Now, what happened in the 1830s, around the time when communism started getting its legs, was that, and this was again in the Frankfurt School, primarily Jewish people, Jewish philosophers, spreading this ideology. What happened was there was a split that was a direct result of the Enlightenment era that had happened 100 years earlier. And this split was between logical positivism, which was basically the idea that logic and the Enlightenment and sort of this objective reasoning worldview could give us our moral intuitions post Christian sort of Dark Ages theology, Christian literalism. And the other viewpoint, sort of the ugly younger brother of this perspective, even though, don't get me wrong, Enlightenment values have their problems, and this is why this problem won't go away until we deal with those problems, which is why I'm so interested in philosophy and epistemology. Regardless, the counterpoint to sort of Enlightenment Western logic was effectively Hegelian philosophy. And Hegelian philosophy is I would say it's kind of like Hermeticism's ugly younger brother. It takes the idea of a dialectic very seriously. It takes the idea of everything has to exist in conjunction with its opposition. And what that basically means is that for every truth, there is a counter-truth. For every experience that you can have, there is a counter-experience that nullifies it. So it basically is a sum-zero belief system that takes the assumptions of logical positivism and negates them. Because in logical positivism, there's this idea that if you look at reality carefully enough, what you get is one singular truth. That is not what Hegelian philosophy says at all. What Hegelian philosophy says is that if you look at reality closely, what you get is an equal pair of opposite truths. And that's very important if you want to understand these Black Lives Matter people, these sort of critical race theory, these critical queer theory, these radical feminist people, these neo-Marxists who are starting communist takeovers of cities like in Chaz and CHOP in Washington and Oregon. If you want to understand these people, what you have to do is look at reality from their perspective. Of course, their arguments make no sense. They don't believe in argumentation in the same way that you do. What they believe in is that reality does not have to make sense. What makes sense, ultimately, is the idea of praxis. And praxis, whatever it is not logical. What praxis means, effectively, is so look at it from their perspective. If you believe that reality can be reduced not to one single objective truth, but to two equal and opposite subjective truths, then the praxis is basically what you decide to do about that. And of course, what you decide to do about facts is not evidence from the facts. So say you do an experiment, you extract out one result that you find to be objective and not have an equal opposite response. That still does not necessarily tell you what to do about that objective reality. Assuming that that is indeed an objective reality and you didn't make a mistake, or that such a thing is even possible, which is definitely up for debate. However, if you believe that reality can basically be condensed down to two underlying subjective realities, then the only thing that you can really do from that perspective is approach a utopia, because there is not one thing that is true. There are two equal and opposite things that are true, and then the question is, what are you going to do about them? And the answer to that is, for these people, is, and this is where it diverges from Hermeticism, is utopian praxis. Moving towards a system whereby the lower class overtakes the upper class and equalizes and becomes perfect. Society becomes perfected. Now, this doesn't work for many reasons, but that's not what this video is necessarily about. Marxism is pretty easy to refute as an ideology, especially because it's already failed all over the world. These people still believe what they believe. So, you cannot beat... From a game theoretical perspective, if your goal is to argue with these people, you are going to lose if you have an Enlightenment viewpoint. If you have a logical viewpoint where you believe that reality is reducible to one objective reality upon careful consideration, you are going to lose the debate to somebody who has a dialectic viewpoint, because their viewpoint can move in more directions. This is like a worm and a bird, effectively. Imagine that a worm can only really move in a couple of different directions. It has a limited sphere of potential that it can move around in. It's bound to the ground, it's bound to a certain layer of the earth's soil. A bird does not have these same limitations. A bird has more dimensionally rich movement capacity. If you start thinking about argumentation in this way, where you have one person who believes in objective reality, who believes in truth, who believes in sort of a concrete, self-evident experience, and you have another person who can go literally anywhere they want with their mind, in a debate, the illogical person has more degrees of freedom to reason with than the logical person, especially because the logical person they don't necessarily have a justification for their action. The person who's engaging in the dialectic doesn't need a justification for their action because they don't believe in logical proof to begin with. So I'm not saying that one of these is right and the other isn't. What I am saying is that if you want to beat these activists at their own game, you cannot play your game, because your game is not dimensionally rich enough you are basically a worm who's being picked apart by a bird. If you want to beat these people at their own game, you have to use essentially force. You have to collapse the argument down to one dimension, and then you have to ask them to leave. So this would be the perfect debate with one of these people. The debate is now over. That's all you can do. You cannot engage illogical people on logical terms, because they are going to what did Mark Twain say? You can't argue with a stupid person because they'll drag you down to your level and beat you with experience. You're not going to convince these people to have an enlightened perspective through rational argument. The only thing you can do is exclude them permanently from the political conversation. So what that means is we need to determine what rules of evidence are, what rules of logic are, what the rules of a debate are. And this is very different from the way we have, for instance, political debates now, because we don't respect people enough to call presidential candidates even on their logical fallacies. This is why Trump can go into a debate and be like, well, I have big hands and you have small hands. Ha ha, my pee-pee big. And then Mitt Romney has to defend why his pee-pee is not small. Or whoever it was. This is not a logical, coherent form of debate. It's a dialectical form of debate. In the same way, if somebody comes into a debate and says, well, my opponent is racist and therefore has this perspective and is wrong, the correct logical response to that, if you want to win the debate, is to set the debate up so that that person cannot even make their point. It's like, oh no, you violated the rules of the debate. You are now asked to leave. You can't engage illogical people on logical terms. They have more degrees of freedom. They will beat you if you engage them in logical debate. So you have to set the debate up so that certain things are explicitly prohibited, unless you want to spend an hour debating and trying to defend why you're not racist or misogynistic or, homophobic or something. You'll waste the entire discussion, and they'll win because you'll be defending yourself against false accusations. So the only way that, final point, the only way that this can work out in the favor of logical people is if a person violates the clear rules of a debate, they are forcibly removed from the building. That's it. That's the only way this can win. If you engage illogical people on illogical terms, they will outmaneuver you and crush you. And you will look like an insecure idiot. If they are merely asked to leave, they don't get a political voice and you win. That's it. Till next time.